The blue light from my laptop screen was the only thing illuminating my studio apartment at 11:47 p.m. when I opened the email that changed everything. 7 years. 7 licensing exams. Thousands of hours of practice problems, failed vignettes, and coffee-fueled study sessions that had turned pieces of my hair gray before I turned 35. And there it was, 4 letters on a white background against the silence of a Tuesday night. Pass. I became a licensed architect at 11:47 p.m. alone, in a 600 square foot apartment in Chicago, eating leftover pad thai with a plastic fork, with no one to tell. I sat there for a while just looking at the screen. I'd imagined this moment many times over the years, the way you imagine things you're not sure will actually happen. In my imagination, there were people around me. In reality, there was a half-eaten carton of noodles and a ceiling fan that rattled when the heat kicked on. I told myself the real celebration could wait. My firm, Harmon and Reed, was already planning a formal dinner for the following Friday, a proper recognition of my new license and my promotion to associate principal, the first woman to hold that title in the firm's 42-year history. I had reserved a table for 4 at Elysian, a restaurant on the 23rd floor of a building downtown that had a view of Lake Michigan I'd been wanting to show my family for years. I sent the details 3 weeks in advance. The restaurant name and address, the time, the dress code, what to expect at a firm dinner of this nature. I even included a short paragraph explaining what associate principal meant, the seniority it represented, the first-generation significance of it, because I already knew without bitterness, just fact, that no one would think to ask. My father had missed my undergraduate graduation at the University of Michigan. My brother had a travel baseball tournament in Columbus that weekend, a regional qualifier, and my father never missed a game. My mother stayed home with him. I was 22 and I told myself families made hard choices between competing obligations. I understood. I did understand, the way you understand something that still leaves a mark. My father had missed my graduate school thesis review, the one where my coastal resilience housing project won the departmental award, and my thesis advisor, a man who did not give compliments as a habit, stood in front of the entire department and called it the most sophisticated student work he had seen in 11 years. My mother said money was tight that weekend. Gas was expensive, and it was a 4-hour drive from home. I stood at the front of the presentation room in front of professors and peers and photographers from the school's communications office, and I smiled until my face hurt, and I thought about the 4-hour drive, and I said nothing to anyone. My parents had missed the regional AIA, Emerging Professional Awards ceremony, when I was 29. I had won the award for a public transit shelter design that got picked up by a national trade publication. The ceremony was in the city, 40 minutes from where my parents lived. My brother was moving apartments that weekend, and they had gone to help him carry boxes. I had a drawer full of achievements and a consistent absence where my family should have been standing. But this was different. This was the end of 7 years of licensing exams taken in sterile testing centers across the Chicagoland area, each one covering a different domain: project management, building systems, site planning, practice management, each one requiring months of preparation layered on top of a full-time job. This was the one that meant something different than all the others. This was the dinner I had reserved 4 seats for 2 months ahead of time. The text from my mother came Thursday morning, 20 hours before the dinner. Honey, slight change of plans. Your brother just told us Jess's parents are flying in from Phoenix this weekend only. Their schedules are so crazy. He really wants to do a big welcome dinner on Friday to make a good impression. We'll celebrate with you soon, okay? We're so proud of you. Love you so much. I read it standing in the kitchen with my coffee, and then I set the mug down very carefully and read it again. Jess was my brother's girlfriend. They had been together for 6 months. I had met her once, briefly, at a birthday dinner for my father, and she had seemed perfectly fine as a person. Her parents were flying in from Phoenix for a weekend visit, and my parents, who lived 40 minutes from downtown Chicago, were canceling on a celebration that had been on the calendar for 3 weeks in order to attend a welcome dinner for a woman my brother had been dating since the previous spring. I sat down at the kitchen table. I thought about all the times I had drafted a response like this, the long version, the one where I laid it all out, the one where I listed the graduation and the thesis and the award and said, "Do you see the pattern?" I had written versions of that message in journals and in the notes app on my phone, and once in an actual letter that I never sent. And every time, I had decided that sending it would accomplish nothing. That people who couldn't see the pattern after 11 years would not be illuminated by a letter. I typed, "Okay." I hit send. I drank my coffee. I went to work. The private room at Elysian had floor-to-ceiling windows on the north and west walls and a view of the lake that changed color as the light moved. The firm had arranged a long table set for 11 people from the office and the 4 empty seats I had reserved. My managing partner, a measured woman named Patricia who had been in architecture for 30 years and who did not display emotion at work as a general principle, arrived before most others. She looked at the empty chairs without saying anything. Then she looked at me with an expression I would think about afterward for weeks. She put her hand on my shoulder for a moment. That was all. My closest friend at the firm, the woman who had been at the office the night I first sat for my site planning exam, and had driven me to the testing center at 6 in the morning and waited in the parking lot with coffee for when I came out. She had arrived early and put a small vase of white tulips at the empty place setting that was clearly meant for the person of honor. She knew I loved tulips. I had mentioned it once, 2 years before, in passing, and she had remembered. That is the kind of thing that matters. The dinner was everything I might have hoped the evening would be if I had allowed myself to hope. The food was excellent. The conversation moved between projects and memories and the kind of humor that develops in groups of people who have spent years in close, stressful proximity. My colleague gave a toast that made 3 people laugh so hard they had to put down their wine glasses. And then she said something true and simple about who I was, and the room went quiet in the way that means people are feeling something they weren't prepared to feel. Patricia presented me with a framed promotion letter bearing the firm's seal and my full name and the new title. She said a few words about what the firm had looked like before I arrived and what it looked like now, and drew a direct line between those 2 versions that made my chest tighten with something I can only describe as being witnessed. Then it was my turn to speak. I had prepared 3 index cards: professional gratitude, forward-looking optimism, a reference to the firm's history and where we were headed, safe, appropriate, the kind of remarks that get polite applause and are forgotten before dessert. I stood at the small podium they had set up near the west window. The lake was dark and enormous behind me, and the city's lights were cutting long reflections across the water. I looked out at the 11 people at the table, and then I looked at the 4 empty chairs. I put the index cards face down on the podium. I said, "I want to start with something honest." The room shifted. I said, "I reserved those 4 seats for my family. They're not here. My brother's girlfriend's parents are visiting from Phoenix this weekend, and a welcome dinner for them took priority over tonight. I found out yesterday morning." No one moved. I said, "This isn't the first time. My college graduation, my brother had a baseball tournament. My graduate thesis presentation, the drive was too long. My regional AIA award, at 29 my brother was moving apartments. Tonight my brother's girlfriend has family in town. There's always something. There has always been something." I looked at the woman who had driven me to my first licensing exam and waited in the parking lot. She was gripping the edge of the table with both hands. I said, "For 11 years I have been very disciplined about managing this disappointment quietly, making it smaller than it actually was, telling myself that people express love in different ways, that presence wasn't the only measure, that I shouldn't need external validation to feel proud of what I was doing. I was, in my professional life, a very good architect. In my personal life, I was an exceptional builder of excuses on behalf of people who never asked me to build them." Someone made a small sound, involuntary, like air leaving a room. I said, 7 years ago, I sat for my first licensing exam in a testing center off the highway in Schaumburg, Illinois. I had studied for 12 weeks. I was terrified. I did not tell my family how terrified I was because I had learned not to take up that kind of space with them. I drove there alone. I sat in the waiting area alone and looked at the practice questions on my phone and tried not to shake. I took the exam. I drove home alone. And then I didn't tell anyone in my family the result for 3 days, because when I did tell them, my mother said, "That's great, honey," and my father said, "Good job," and the conversation moved on in less than 45 seconds, and I thought, I did not need to save that moment for 3 days. Patricia was watching me from the far end of the table. Her face was very still. I said, "Tonight I became the first female associate principal in this firm's 42-year history." The people who should understand what that means are at a dinner for a woman my brother has been dating since April. And I want to be clear, I am not devastated. I am not falling apart. I drove here tonight and I walked into this room and I looked at those empty chairs and I felt something I have been slowly feeling for years. I felt done. I held up the framed promotion letter. I said, not done in a dramatic way. Done in a quiet and permanent way. Done saving seats. Done managing my achievements down to a size that fits inside conversations about my brother's life. Done engineering accommodations for people whose schedules never once bent toward mine. My voice cracked then. I let it crack. I said, I am standing at this window at the end of 11 years, and the family I actually have, the people who showed up, who covered my projects during exam season, who texted me at midnight when I was failing practice vignettes, who put white tulips at my place setting tonight, is sitting right in front of me. You are the colleagues who became something else. You know what you are. I looked directly at my colleague. She was crying, without any apparent effort to stop. I said, thank you, for 11 years. For every early morning and every late night and every single time you asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. The seats that mattered were never empty. They were always right here. I did not know that until tonight, but I know it now, and I am not going to forget it. I stepped back from the podium. The room was silent for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then my colleagues started clapping. And Patricia followed, and then the rest of the table, and the applause in that private room with its view of the dark lake felt like a correction. Like something being put back into its proper position after years of being slightly, constantly wrong. Afterward, a junior architect on my team, a woman 2 years out of school, working her way through the first of her own licensing exams, came up to me and stood very close and said quietly, my parents have never come to anything either. I thought I was the only one in our field who had that. I never told anyone because it seemed embarrassing. I said, it's not embarrassing, it's just lonely. There's a difference. She nodded. I could tell she was filing that away. Patricia was the last one still in the room when I was getting my coat. She said, you should know, I have been watching you for 11 years, wondering when you were going to stop apologizing for taking up the space you earned. I'm glad I got to see it. I drove home along the lakefront. The city was reflected in the water in long ribbons of gold and white. I checked my phone at a red light. 31 text messages. 8 voicemails. I put the phone in my bag and drove the rest of the way home without looking at it. I read the messages at my kitchen table. From my brother. What the actual hell? You made a scene at a work dinner because mom and dad had other plans one time. Jess called me crying. Her parents heard about it. You completely overshadowed their visit and made everyone feel guilty for having a life. From my father. This was unprofessional and embarrassing. You don't bring family business to a work event. I don't know where this is coming from, but we need to talk. From my mother. I'm heartbroken that instead of calling me privately, you chose to humiliate us in front of your colleagues. We have always supported you. One scheduling conflict doesn't mean we don't love you. I read that one twice. One scheduling conflict. I thought about the baseball tournament, the thesis presentation, the AIA award, the 7 years of licensing exams. I thought about what a scheduling conflict looked like when it happened once versus what it looked like when it was a pattern so consistent you could set a clock by it. I thought about the difference between those two things, and I sat with that difference for a while in my quiet kitchen. Then I read the other messages. From an unknown number. Someone at the adjacent table at Elysian tonight recorded part of your speech. I posted it on LinkedIn. I hope that's okay. It needed to be heard. From my colleague. It's already at 40,000 views. I cannot stop crying. Go to sleep. From another unknown number. My sister sent me this video, and I watched it in my car, in the parking lot of a Whole Foods, and I am still here 45 minutes later. I'm a structural engineer. My parents didn't come to my PE exam celebration, because my brother had a flag football game. I thought I was crazy for how much it hurt. Thank you for saying it out loud. By morning, the video had 350,000 views. By Friday evening, it crossed 1 million. By the end of the weekend, the number was somewhere above 2 million and still climbing. And the comments were a river that I could not stop reading, even though reading them made me feel things I did not have language for yet. I waited 30 years for my parents to attend something of mine. They finally made it to my retirement dinner. Once. I had already built a full life by then, and it was almost beside the point. But I want you to know I stood up there and thought of you. My mother told me I was too sensitive. My father said I was ungrateful. When I read your speech, I realized I wasn't either of those things. I was just the wrong child. I'm a first-generation college student, 2 years from my own architectural license. I watched your video 6 times last night. I'm going to pass this exam. I'm going to pass all of them. And I'm going to be fine about who is or isn't in the room when I do. I did one interview, not the profile pieces from the lifestyle publications that reached out, not the podcast about women in architecture, not the morning show segment. I wrote a long-form piece for Architect Magazine, the national publication of the AIA, the organization that had given me an Emerging Professional Award 9 years earlier, at a ceremony my parents missed because my brother was moving apartments. They asked why the speech had connected with so many people. I wrote, "Architecture is the art of building structures designed to hold things: weight, weather, time, human life. We spend years learning to calculate load and span and stress. But we also spend years, most of us, I think, building elaborate structures for other people's comfort that were never designed to support our own weight. We shore up relationships that cannot hold us. We reinforce walls that serve someone else's foundation. We engineer accommodation after accommodation for people who are not engineering anything in return. I did this for 11 years. I was a good architect professionally and a poor one personally. The night I stopped was the first night I built something that actually stood. The piece ran with a photo taken on the roof of the community center I had designed on the south side, a project that had taken 3 years and was the work I was most proud of in my career. The sky behind me was a particular kind of gray that made everything feel exact and clear. I was looking directly into the camera, and I did not look like someone waiting for permission. My brother stopped speaking to me 2 weeks after the dinner. His girlfriend made a post on social media about people who couldn't be happy for others and needed to make everything about themselves. Several people I didn't know liked it. I read it once and did not respond and did not read it again. 6 months after the dinner, on a Sunday afternoon in late October, my mother called. She said, "Hi, sweetheart, how are you doing?" I said, "I'm okay. How are you?" She said, "Good, good. We're good. Listen, you know your father and I have been talking about the kitchen renovation forever. We finally think we're ready to move on it. And with your position now, and all the connections you have in the field, we thought maybe you could take a look at the space and give us some direction. Even just sketch something out. It wouldn't take you long. I know it wouldn't. And it would really mean so much." I was quiet for a moment. She said, "It would mean a lot to your father to have you involved." I said, "Mom, my rate for residential consultation is $175 an hour. I'm happy to refer you to a colleague who specializes in residential renovation work." She said, "We're not asking you to charge us. We're family." I said, "Family was supposed to be at my firm dinner in May." Silence. She said, "That's not fair. We had a conflict." I said, "You've had a conflict at every significant moment in my professional life for 11 years. This is the first time you've called me since the dinner, and you're calling to ask for free professional services. I love you, but I'm not going to do that." She said, very quietly, "I don't know when you got so cold." I said, "I'm not cold." I finally stopped being confused about what this relationship is. Those are different things. I set down the phone and sat at my drafting table for a while. The October light was coming in flat and clean through the west window, laying a long gold rectangle across the surface of my work. I had 3 projects open: a mixed-use residential development in Logan Square that had been complicated and interesting from the beginning, a school renovation in Evanston, and a small commission I had taken on for no fee, a ramp and accessible entrance redesign for a Carnegie Library built in 1924 that had never once been properly updated for the people it was supposed to serve. The library project was my favorite thing I had ever worked on. The building had a structural logic that was more than a century old, and working within it required a kind of patience and attentiveness that felt different from everything else. Nothing about it was fast. Every decision mattered. But every solution I found felt like the most honest work of my career. My colleague came over that evening with a good bottle of wine and the cheese from the shop on Dammon she knew I liked. We sat at my kitchen table, and she asked how I was doing, not the surface version of the question, but the real one, and I told her about my mother's call. She listened the way she always listened, without making it about anything except what I was saying. She said, "Do you think they'll ever actually understand?" I thought about it before I answered. I said, "No." And I think I spent a very long time believing that the right explanation would change that. That if I found the correct framing, the right moment, the right tone, something would finally click. But some people can only see you as a character in someone else's story. My brother is the protagonist of my parents' story. I've been a recurring background figure. You can't explain your way out of a role someone assigned you before you had a say. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "For what it's worth, you're the main character in mine." I laughed. It was the kind of laugh that meant several things at once, gratitude being the loudest of them. The speech still circulates. Every spring, when graduation season arrives and people begin thinking about accomplishments and who is or isn't in the audience, it picks up again and travels through the parts of the internet where people share the things that made them feel less alone. I receive messages from women who watched it the night before their own licensing exams. From young architects who have printed out one of the lines and taped it above their desk. From a man in his late 60s who wrote to say he watched it after his own retirement party, where he had sat at a table his 3 children had promised to attend, and didn't, and that it had given him a language for something he had been carrying without a name for decades. My parents attended one professional event in my 11 years at Harmon and Reed. They came to the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the community center on the south side, in November, on a cold gray day that smelled like winter coming. They stood at the edge of the crowd in their good coats, and my mother took a photo of the building facade and posted it on Facebook with the caption, "So proud of our daughter, the architect." 14 of her friends liked it. I stood at the entrance of a building I had spent 3 years designing, where I had made hundreds of decisions about sightlines and materials and the quality of light at 3 in the afternoon, in a room where children would do homework and older adults would gather, and people who needed a quiet place would find one. I had cared about every inch of it, and I felt, standing there watching my parents take a photo for a Facebook post, nothing in particular, not anger, not satisfaction, not grief. The absence had already done what it was going to do. What was left was simply weather. The people who had made the building possible were standing all around me. My colleague, who had reviewed my permit, set twice, and caught the kind of coordination error that saves a project. Patricia, who had gone to bat with the city on a zoning question that could have killed the project in its second year. The junior architect on my team, who had grown so much over those 3 years that I could now give her a set of drawings and trust it completely. The old office manager who, every year on my work anniversary without exception, left a handwritten card on my desk describing something specific she had noticed about my work or my character in the past year. These were my people. They had not been assigned to me by blood or by accident of geography. They had been assembled over years through the accumulation of small choices. Someone staying late, someone asking the real question, someone driving to a testing center at 6 in the morning and waiting in the parking lot with coffee, someone putting white tulips at a place setting for a person they simply paid attention to. The framing of my license hangs in my office now. Below it, in a simple black frame, is a printed email I received from a woman in Atlanta. She wrote, "I watched your video the night before my 7th and final licensing exam. My husband had told me repeatedly that I didn't need to do this, that I already had a good job at a firm, and the license was just a piece of paper. I passed the exam. I received my license 2 weeks ago. I framed it on the wall of the home office he called unnecessary, in the room I wasn't supposed to need. I don't know you, but you felt like someone who would want to know." She was right. I did want to know. I want to know every time. 4 empty chairs, 2 million views, one truth that I spent 11 years arriving at, and that I am still arriving at, in the way of all the truths that matter. The people who build you are rarely the ones who were handed the assignment. The most important structure you will ever design is the one you build not for the people who should have shown up, but for the ones who actually did, the ones who arrived without being begged, who stayed without being needed, who saw exactly what you were building and said, "I'm here. Keep going."